Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sam Cronin, and I set the healthcare strategy and activities of the UK Israel Tech Hub, which is a UK government team operating out of British Embassy Israel that works with British multinational corporations to help solve their innovation challenges with Israeli innovations. In healthcare, of course, I also do a lot with the UK's NHS. Just as a bit of background on us, in 8 years, we've built more than 200 concrete partnerships between the UK and Israel with a total deal value exceeding £100 million and an estimated impact to the British economy of more than £1 billion. I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a bureaucrat. My background was once upon a time in research, and I focus on identifying needs and finding and matching solutions to these. So first off, if you're an Israeli startup and we don't know each other, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn or on our websites, and we'll find some time for a virtual coffee. So just as a bit of background, we put together this webinar series because everywhere we looked, we saw webinars advertised around how COVID has changed things, the future of healthcare, the future of this, the future of that, COVID. But as someone who understands healthcare and comes from this space, I know that this is a slow game. Many of you are innovating in areas with absolutely nothing to do with COVID. Some of them will have been impacted by it. Many of them won't be. Some of you will be struggling to raise financing, unfortunately, or your sales will have dipped. So given that a large part of my job is to support the UK's NHS with Israeli innovations, I need to do what I can to ensure that Israeli entrepreneurs have the right knowledge, tools, contacts to successfully do business in Britain. And the UK's NHS, as you may or may not be aware, is the largest healthcare provider in the world, responsible for more than 60 million patients. It is overburdened, underfinanced, in desperate need of innovation, and also a national treasure. And it's not an easy target. So we've put together this webinar series. We're running one of these webinars every 2 weeks until mid-August, always focused on the UK healthcare angle. And we've partnered with some of the leading consultancies in each of these domains. Today we have with us Doctors Hugh Harvey and Sal Razaki of Hardian Health. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, and I feel a little bit ridiculous saying that, like a teacher in school, but there is a function on Zoom to raise your hand. Or you can type in the Q&A function, and Sal is going to be keeping an eye on the questions. And there's also going to be some time for Q&A at the end. You should also feel free to introduce yourselves to one another in the chat function if you'd like to. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to hand over to Hugh and Sal of Hardian Health, who will be illuminating on market entry into the UK and the role played by the generation of clinical evidence and regulatory approval. Hugh.
Thank you very much, Sam, and hello to everyone who's joined us online. I'm Dr. Hugh Harvey. I was a consultant radiologist here in the NHS, and I've now got experience. I've worked at two well-established startups now in the UK, and some of the devices that I've helped build and develop are now being used in the NHS. So I now run a consultancy called Hardian Health, and I want to help other people follow that same track and get their products into the hands of clinicians and end users. The title of today's talk, slightly clickbaity, the secret formula to getting digital health tech to market. It's really no secret. You need clinical evidence and you need regulatory approval. At least that's the bare minimum requirements. Without these, no one's going to buy or use your products. So today I will be talking about a few things at a relatively high level, and we can go in depth on each of the points depending where the questions from the audience take us today. First of all, why and how do you sell a product in the UK? Why does the UK cause such a fuss about clinical evidence, especially around digital health tech? How should you approach it? And how do you approach regulations as well? So let's start with the obvious stuff. Why should you sell your product in the UK? Well, the UK has the world's only nationalised health service in its entirety. So every single person who lives and pays taxes in the UK is allowed to use our national health service free at the point of care. And the NHS itself spends approximately £27 billion per year on all sorts of products and services, from rubber gloves to syringes to outsourcing medical scans and health tech products. But the route to market is not so clear. How do you sell into a system which covers an entire country? There are bureaucratically standardized procurement pathways, but none such directly exist for certain classes of health tech products. There's certainly no separate procurement process for artificially intelligence-based systems or app-based digital health therapeutics. So the question that we often get asked, and many people will be asking the Israeli Tech Hub, is how do we approach the NHS to actually sell the product? And today's talk is going to be about what you need to have in your arsenal of materials ready to approach the NHS. It's an evidence-based healthcare system. It does not buy things that have no evidence base, and this evidence needs to be both clinical and health economics. So why is there such a fuss about evidence? It's well recognized in the pharmaceutical industry that drugs don't deliver safe and effective care. It's the people and systems around those drugs that do. The drugs themselves are proven to work, but you need to have the system around it and the people trained and aware of their use and contraindications for them to be effective. And the same goes for any digital health product or software that you want to put into a healthcare practice. And I have a personal mantra that some of you who are familiar with me will know, is that algorithms are the new drugs. Hence this little picture of a pill on a circuit board. And I don't mean literally you swallow an algorithm and it makes you feel better, but there are certain processes, which we're going to talk about today, to getting them to market, which are almost identical to the processes of getting drugs to market. And anybody who's in a tech startup or has come from an engineering or software engineering background and is now approaching the healthcare space needs to start thinking about what they're building in terms of being a medical device, which is almost the equivalent of being a drug. And you have to think about it that rigorously. So what is the overall strategy? You have to have a top-down go-to-market approach. You can't be sort of bottom-up and just say, we're going to work it upwards from our product. You have to think bigger picture than that. And these are the four main pillars that I consult in now. And today we're going to be talking about the first two, which is clinical validation and regulation. So clinical validation obviously is about proving that your product works. And one of the key ways of proving that is through studies and then their subsequent publications. And that the aim of that is obviously increase your academic credibility, spread your reputation, and a good, well-written paper in a well-known, high-impact journal will be your best marketing material, over and above any glossy brochure or PowerPoint that you can make. The second part of the puzzle is regulation. The vast majority of health technology, depending on what its intended use is, will be a regulated medical device. So you need to ensure that regulation and the requirements and documentation that encompass that are part of your company culture. It's not something separate that's done last minute. It's thinking about your company and your product as a medical device company. You wouldn't go to market with a new drug without thinking like a pharma company, and it should be exactly the same for health technology. And with proper regulation, you will improve your product's go-to-market timeline and strategy, and your product's visibility across not only regulatory networks, but also your consumers. The NHS will also demand health economics. And what health economics means is it's not just about, this is our price point, it's about at our price point, and with the evidence that we have demonstrated to date, we can show long-term cost effectiveness of using our product. And this demonstrates that you understand the business case specific to the NHS and the value to those specific purchases. So if you're approaching the NHS, you really need to work on a health economic strategy for the NHS. You need to be understanding local care pathways and how your intervention will fit into those and change those care pathways, and what the economic impact of those are at every point and at the end of the stream. And then the last part is procurement. How do you figure out the procurement networks to accelerate your clinical adoption and navigate those pathways, which can be completely opaque to people coming from outside of the UK? So let's have a look at the clinical evidence. Lots of companies are unsure as how to approach what clinical evidence they should be demonstrating. So these are the key factors. First of all, you need to make sure that your product, whatever it is, makes sense scientifically. And this can be done in early feasibility studies or early, what's known as real-world testing, where you take your product and you test it on a small subsample in a controlled environment. And the reason you need to do this is that no one is going to purchase your product unless the science behind it is sound. So you can build an app to say, treat or manage a certain disease, but you don't know it does so until you've actually tested it. So you might want to be testing it in the lab setting, but you'll definitely want to be testing it in the real world at some point. And by real world, it can mean one of two things. It can mean either in a controlled environment in a clinical study, and that might be a randomized control study, which is kind of the gold standard for this evidence, or it might be in post-market evidence. So once it's on market, you are actually following up with the outcomes that are changed by your intervention. And then the last bit is to publish those results. From a regulatory standpoint, you don't need to publish in an academic journal all your results, but it makes absolute sense to try and do so whenever you can. It's very rare, unless your paper gets retracted or slammed for poor methodology, it's very rare that a good scientific paper will reflect badly on you or your product. What's key to approaching clinical evidence is engaging with clinicians and academic scientists who understand the proper methodologies, not only of how to design and conduct the studies, but how to report them as well. I've seen a few startups try and approach this without any clinical in-house or expertise external to them. And it's very important to engage with the entire medical community. And increasingly in the NHS, they also want to see patient involvement, known as PPI, public and patient initiatives, involved in your research as well, to make sure that you're including not only their voice, but their impressions of how your product is working. This is the standardized levels of evidence sort of pyramid that the academic scientists will well recognize. And a lot of startups will start off with just editorials and expert opinion, or publishing blogs or YouTube videos or whatever. But that will not get you sales within the NHS. You need to be working your way up this pyramid of clinical evidence. And the top being meta-analyses. And the meta-analysis is where someone else, independent of you or your company, will look at all of the published literature that's already available based around your intervention or ones exactly similar to it, and pull out the data from all of those interventional studies and come to a conclusion on the effectiveness and efficacy of that solution. So clearly you can't do a meta-analysis on your own as a startup, especially if you're inventing a new type of device. But what you can certainly work towards is the second level down, which is randomized controlled trials. And a randomized control trial means that roughly 50% of the patients that you're intervening on are using your product or device, and the other 50% are using the current standard of care or a placebo. And you compare the outcomes on both sides, and you hope to show that there is a significant benefit from using your product or intervention. So this should be done in phases of trials. You can't do this all in one go. It has to be done in a stepwise fashion. And I've borrowed this very much from the 4 phases of trials that drugs go through before they get to market. So these are divided into the 4 phases. And in phase 1, it really is feasibility. Test it on a small cohort under your perfect conditions. So you build your perfect data set and you test whether or not your intervention can work. Now, I've called this clinical trial phases for AI, but it's applicable for any therapeutic device as well. Phase 2, you'll get a larger real-world simulation environment. So this might be real-world data in a retrospective fashion. And it might be done on external data that you have never seen before, or cases that you haven't seen before. And then you go to phase 3, which is effectiveness, where you actually deploy it in a real clinical situation. And this is where you could do your RCT, your randomized controlled trial. And then once you've done that, you can submit your regulatory clinical evaluation and change control plan, which I'll get into later. And then once you're on market, this is your phase 4, where you have to monitor your performance. And it's an absolute requirement to maintain monitoring of your performance wherever possible. And the regulators are cottoning onto the fact that they have a really good opportunity here to follow digital health interventions over time, much better than they could for drugs. So you need to be thinking about the standardized, so the pharma route to market, these phases of clinical trials, and how they apply to your digital health tech. I recently published a paper, co-authored with some of these eminent people. You may recognize a few names. We looked at every single paper that was on deep learning in radiology. So we were looking at a lot of commercial products, but also just academic prototypes. And we were trying to figure out what is the level of evidence out there already. And we were looking at the reporting standards and their claims and the design of those studies. And it was quite disappointing to find that the vast majority aren't using randomized control trials yet. And the ones that have been done are at huge risk of bias, and they didn't really adhere to proper reporting standards. So it's really important, I think, that as an entire industry, people step up. They recognize that there are proper ways of doing things that have been around for many, many years, and they engage with the relevant academic scientists to help them design, conduct, and report these studies appropriately. And that will help diminish future risk of bias. It will really enhance and elevate the real world clinical relevance of the evidence that's happening, and also improve the reporting and transparency around what these devices can and can't actually achieve. I'm going to pause there because before I move on to the regulatory side, just to take any questions that there may have been in the chat about the clinical evidence pathways. So do let me know, Sal, if you want to unmute yourself, if there's any questions from the audience.
No, we're okay so far.
We're okay so far, everyone's happy. Good. So the second part of the puzzle is how do you approach regulation? And it does go slightly hand in hand with clinical evidence, because the regulators also want to see your clinical evidence as well as lots of other technical bits and bobs. The first thing to say about regulation is that the whole of medicine is a regulated industry, from doctors needing a license to practice, similar for any other healthcare professional, to any drug needing to be approved, and to any healthcare software having to have the relevant security standards and quality assurance standards. There is absolutely no way anybody is getting to market without engaging with some form of regulator. And regulation should be seen as a culture within your company, and it should be an attitude to the way that you approach the entire sector. It should not be seen as a barrier. It is not a barrier. It is there to make sure that you are meeting the right standards. And you need to buy into this from absolute day one. And I have seen companies spend years building prototypes, minimally viable products, and trying to suddenly get to market, and they've not done a single day's worth of regulatory documentation or consideration. And it hasn't been part of their culture. And ultimately they will fail, because it's very hard to do this stuff retrospectively. So if you are not already thinking about regulation, you need to start doing it right now. I cannot warn you enough. The second thing is gather your clinical evidence. So do all the things I've spoken about so far, and I'm going to show you what the rough format is for presenting this to the regulators. You need to write up and maintain all of your regulatory documentation. You can outsource this to consultants such as ourselves, or you can get in-house regulatory expertise if your budget allows. And the most important thing, with the new version of the medical device regulations coming out in Europe and the new versions of the FDA regulations that are coming out, is to keep track of how it performs after you've released it on market permanently. It is not a done and finished job once you've put your thing on the App Store or sold to your first client. It is absolutely vital that people in the health tech industry are monitoring their performance after release. And this is called post-market clinical follow-up, or PMCF. So the regulatory pathway is really complex and convoluted, and it requires a mix of technical knowledge to understand all of the engineering components of what's known as a technical file, and also all of the clinical components as what's known as a clinical evaluation report. And you will need expertise in both. So you will need technical regulatory consultants and experienced medical writers and clinicians who've had experience in writing what are known as the clinical evaluation reports. And these fit together absolutely entwined, and you can't really do them separately from each other. But what's key, if I highlight this, is what's at the top, which is the intended use statement. You need to decide exactly and specifically what your product is going to do. Because if you keep changing what you want your product to do, everything else will have to keep changing as well. So to keep it simple on yourself, make sure that in your product roadmap, you have a very clear intended use statement or use specification for each product, and they are kept separately and they are constantly reviewed to make sure that all of the follow-on documentation is in line with this. And I'm going to explain a bit more on this as we go through. So this is the regulatory pathway. You can use agile project management methodology for this. And there are standards for medical device software lifecycle processes that you should technically be adhering to. So this is the way that we work as a consultancy, and it's the way that I've successfully brought devices to market in prior careers. The first thing is always define that intended use, and then look at any guidelines that you can around that specific intended use. You will be surprised. You are never going to be the first person in the world who's thought of a specific use case for a health tech. So there may well be guidelines out there already that can help you. You then have to determine what risk class of medical device your product's going to be. And you have to establish what's known as a QMS, a quality management system. And this is your home for all of your regulatory documentation. And within the QMS, you have to have a technical file, a medical device history file, and a design history file. And these are all engineering standards, and you will require time and resource to be able to prepare and develop these regulatory documentations. This is just the start. And this is where every single startup should be at the seed stage. As you mature and you start developing your product, you need to make sure you have a complete regulatory roadmap so you know where you're at and where you need to get to. You need to train all of your staff in how to interact with your quality management system. And you need to choose, well, not every device needs to choose. If you are class 1, you might not need a notified body. A notified body is an external auditing body who give you the certification for regulatory approval. So you need to be able to choose the relevant notified body. Not all notified bodies are approved to work for all types of devices. So you need to find one that's approved for your type of device. If you're using patient data, you will need to show cybersecurity readiness. You will need to be able to document your readiness to maintain and manage supplier relationships. And here comes the first clinical bit. You'll need to conduct a literature review. And I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail, but it stems from what your intended use is. You cannot do a literature review if you don't know exactly what your intended use is. So otherwise you'll just be searching random papers. Based on the results of a literature review, you go to a risk-benefit analysis, and then you can start to build your clinical evaluation plan, map out your studies that you need to do. Then it gets to the deployment stage. Once you've done all that documentation and you've received your CE marking or FDA clearance, then you can start doing all of this technical stuff, and then you can start your post-market surveillance plan, PMS, clinical follow-up, which is your PMCF. And there are mandated guidances on ongoing safety reporting. So you legally have to report every single time your device causes something to go wrong or patient harm, because you're in the healthcare sector now. And you have to annually prepare a periodic safety update report to give back to the regulators. And you can be taken off market if you do not tell the regulators that your device has injured someone or caused a death or something. So you have to take this stuff very seriously and have a plan of how to deal with it. So these are some of the international standards that you will need to become familiar with. Now, I don't know who names these standards, but they've all been given random 5-digit numbers. But the number one thing that you need to know is 13485. If you are building a medical device that is class 1 and above, which is the vast majority of health technology, you will need a quality management system. You will need to have your entire company certified under ISO 13485. And if you aren't, it's absolutely a requirement. And good health tech investors and VC firms won't invest in your Series A round until you get ISO 13485. That should be absolutely crystal clear. So I want everyone who has not got 13485 certification to make sure that that's on their to-do list. And alongside that, if you're dealing with patient data, you will need 27001, which is another ISO standard on information security management. And in fact, the NHS will not buy a product from a company who is not certified in both of these standards. So if you want to take it to market in the NHS, you will need these. If your health technology uses software, which is going to be the vast majority, then you will need to adhere to the software lifecycle processes. This can be fitted into an agile software design lifecycle process. So your engineers, even if they haven't got a health sector background, should be able to conform to this standard. And then everybody will need a risk management tool as well, under this standard 14971. So I'll pause there again. If there have been any questions around the regulatory strategy and the standards, if anybody's got any burning questions there.
There's one question which I think will probably be covered later, but it's regarding if it's a class 1 device, do you need a notified body?
Yeah, okay, so that's a very good question. Not always. If you are a class 1 device and you're not producing something that needs to be sterilized, then you may not need a notified body. The way to check is to go onto your country's government website where they deal with medical devices and have a look at the risk classifications that the EU Commission provide. In rule of thumb, this is not going to be the case for absolutely everybody. If you are a class 1 non-sterile device, you don't need a notified body. That is the rule of thumb. If you're higher than class 1, then you will definitely need a notified body. I hope that answers that question. I will move on unless Salman indicates there's any other questions burning.
There are a couple more, but I think they'd be good for the end because I think some of the content you're going to cover will answer some of them.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into use specification. And this is the absolute crux. When you're starting a startup, it's very common for people to create mission statements and vision statements, which are super high level statements about where the company wants to be. You know, we are going to eradicate cancer or whatever it is that your startup's going to do. The use specification is almost completely opposite. It is a completely specific, bespoke, detailed description of exactly what you intend your software or your intervention to do, and then what you want it to achieve. You have to absolutely meticulously document who is going to be using it, and it might not necessarily be patients, exactly which disease processes you want to be involved with. You can't say we're going to cure all cancer because that's ridiculous. What data you might need and what the benchmarks are for that data. So, you know, if you're creating a mental health app that's meant to, you know, help with depression, what are the metrics of measuring depression that you're going to be benchmarking yourself against? You have to be absolutely clear about which ones you're going to use. And you have to describe the exact environments and situations that you intend your product to be used. I see very often startups say, well, it's going to be, anybody can use this to diagnose anything. Well, that's almost impossible. Your claims are going to be almost impossible to prove. You have to be much, much more specific about that. And designing a proper use specification should be in conjunction. It should be done in conjunction with clinicians and regulatory experts to make sure that A, you're meeting a user need, there's a scientific valid basis, and that, you know, there's an actual use case for this. But also with your marketing team. Your marketing team can only make claims based on what you are regulatory approved to be able to do. And you will only get regulatory approval for your exact use specification. Do not let your marketing team run away with themselves and start claiming things on your website and in your materials that is not in your use specification, or you can get fined and taken off market by the regulatory bodies. So the use specification should be nailed to the foreheads of your marketing team, not literally, figuratively. So why do we have to focus so much on the intended use statement? Because the intention actually defines everything about your medical device. It will define the regulatory pathway you choose. It'll define who can use it, where they can use it, how they can use it. And it will define the risk class of your device. And it will define everything about the clinical validation studies and the reporting that you need to do. And I don't need to remind everybody, but I'm sure you've all read it. Here we go, Annex 16 of the European Commission Medical Device Regulations. This is the definition of a medical device, and it is extremely broad. So I've highlighted it for software. But if you are planning to do any of these things with your health tech intervention, you are a medical device and you need to be very strict about the clinical validation and your regulatory pathways. If you're dealing with human samples, so organs, blood, tissue donations, hair, skin, genetics, you are what's known as an in vitro medical device, and your regulatory burden is even greater. not all devices are in the same risk class. Clearly, some can't kill people and some can't cause injury, and they will do this to different degrees. Now, there is a nuance I think that's important to make clear. The European Commission, which is in charge of giving out the regulatory standards for Europe, is changing from old regulation known as the Medical Device Directives, or the MDD, to new regulation called the Medical Device Regulations, the MDR. So we're switching from MDD to MDR. And under the MDD, which was written a few years back, digital health tech, AI systems weren't really on the radar of the regulators. So at the moment, they can be classed under MDD sometimes as class 1 devices. However, under the new MDR, the vast majority of use cases for health tech are going to be upclassed to moderate risk. And that changes the route to which you can take your device through CE marking. If you are dealing with anything in the cancer space, you are definitely going to be a class 2. And under Europe, this is split into 2 categories. You could be class 2A or 2B. And there's some nuances I'm not going to go into today because it's boring and detailed, but you need to figure out exactly which risk class you're in. Class 3 devices tend to be the ones that can cause serious or detrimental harm to patients, and it's very unlikely a health tech intervention is going to be classed as a class 3 device, though there are some exceptions. And then once you know your intended use, and then you know what claims you want to make, and you know what risk class you are, now you can start planning your clinical evaluation. So you need to figure out what questions need to be asked and answered, and what methodologies you're going to do. So, is there a valid clinical association between what you plan to do and the clinical impact and outcome you want to have? Is there a plausible scientific explanation for your device's use case? So in the case of an AI system, yes, there's a plausible explanation that a machine may be able to review an image and find something. Or if you're doing a digital therapeutic, there's a plausible explanation that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can be delivered via an app. You don't have to then do all of the clinical studies to provide all of the background evidence. You do a literature review. Who else has researched this area? What is the state of the art? What are our competitors doing? A literature review is absolutely vital, and it needs to be part of your regulatory documentation. You then move on to analytical. So you make sure that it's correct, behaving correctly in your test conditions, and you verify it. And then you can do your clinical validations. Does it behave correctly in a real-world clinical setting? And you do this through clinical studies and post-market clinical follow-up. And the regulators want to see you write out a clinical evaluation plan in much more detail than this, but at least covering these highlighted points. And this will form part of your clinical evaluation report. So the clinical evaluation report, or the CER, if you are the chief medical officer of a startup, it is your responsibility to be understanding and filling out the clinical evaluation report. And these documents can reach hundreds of thousands of pages long. And this is in summary, a brief summary of what goes into it. I'm not going to read this all out, but I've highlighted some of the important parts. Everyone involved in the clinical evaluation report doesn't need to be in-house. You can outsource certain parts, but you have to then document CVs of all of the authors. And under one of the ISO standards, which is 14155 for the clinical investigation of medical devices, you have to ensure that then there's an independent expert advisory body overseeing, or at least taking part in, the design and conduct in the clinical investigations that you're doing. The medical device regulations do not prescribe exactly what kind of studies you need to do for what kind of devices. They cannot do that because there's an infinite number of use cases. What they do say is it's your responsibility to ensure independent expert advice, and then to present that to the regulators, and the regulators will say, yes, I think that this is appropriate. The clinical evaluation report obviously stems from your claims and the intended use statement that you want to make. You do your literature review, you produce a clinical evaluation plan, you then do your clinical studies, and then you plan out your post-market activities. It's a really simple 5-step process. The post-market clinical follow-up will involve the following, and it's technical and clinical documentation. So your product lifecycle documentation, because in a post-market situation, you may update your app or your AI software. You need to maintain your quality and your safety documentation. So any quality or safety issues that you've had after being on market. A new requirement under the medical device regulations is every version of your software needs a unique device identifier, or UDI, and it needs to comply with general safety performance requirements under this ISO standards. Your clinical evaluation report needs to be constantly updated with clinical data you're receiving from your clients and customers. And then you need to submit your annual post-market safety report and updates. So that is the overall strategy: clinical validity and regulation. I haven't covered so much health economics and procurement. I believe other seminars in this session run by the Israeli Tech Hub are going to cover these. But I'm very happy to take any further questions from the audience, and I hope this has helped somewhat to clarify some of the mysteries around approaching the NHS and the health tech sector in general.
Yeah, cool. We got some good questions. So one that's just come in, how do the clinical safety standards DCB 0129 and 0160 fit in if your software is overlaid onto NHS data?
That's a very good question. So just to clarify for the wider audience, there are some software safety standards called the DCB standards, which the NHS require that vendors and manufacturers conform to. Now, these are separate to the medical device regulatory standards, but they do overlap a lot with ISO 27001, which is cybersecurity, and a lot of the GSPR, which are the general safety performance requirements that you will also have to adhere to. The DCBs, one half has to be filled in by the vendor, and the other half has to be filled in by the person or the body purchasing your system. But there is a lot of overlap in the content of both. In general, a rule of thumb: if you are certified to ISO 27001 and you have CE marking, you will have more than enough technical documentation to be able to fill in the DCBs very quickly and efficiently.
Okay, I also had a question about FDA. So essentially, is FDA approval sufficient for NHS?
No.
No, is the answer.
So just to give a bit of a wider viewpoint on this, there are different regulatory frameworks in different parts of the world. Everything I've spoken to today is about the European medical device regulations, of which the UK currently adheres to. We don't know in a post-Brexit scenario if the UK is going to continue, but for now, you need to follow the European pathways. The FDA is the American version of the regulatory bodies, and it's run by a government body in America. They have similar but slightly nuanced different processes. And if you want to sell into America, you need FDA clearance or approval, depending what risk class of device you are. An FDA clearance in America will not give you access to the UK market or indeed the European market.
Okay, cool. Another question, in terms of MVPs or pilots for an early stage startup, what is the regulatory requirement and roadmap?
Sorry, I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
I think it's asking, like, if you are an early stage startup and you want to run some early testing, say on a pilot or prototype, what is the regulatory requirement or restriction around doing that?
Okay, so if you want to do early testing, maybe phase 1, phase 2, if you want to use real patient data, you will need to work with the providers of that data to fill in an ethics submission through the Health Research Authority, the HRA, and you will need to use a platform called IRAS, which is the Integrated Research Authority Service, I believe, iras.ac.uk. You will need to fill in that ethics submission, which will detail in full the clinical investigation you want to perform, on which patients, on which data, and that will be submitted to an ethics committee who will then decide whether or not you can have approval for that. You need to do that if you are pre-regulatory approval or you're doing a novel study of a regulatory approved device.
Okay, and about where the test data is from. So do the clinical and validation studies need to be done inside the UK on UK data, or can it be from another country?
So for CE marking, you can get CE marking in any of the EU member states using data from those countries. And that CE mark is then valid anywhere else in Europe. So you don't necessarily need UK data. However, if you want to sell to the NHS, it is always beneficial to have had some UK data in some of your clinical studies. because it shows that it works in this local geography. And this is particularly pertinent to AI systems, which are known to drop somewhat in performance sometimes when you transfer geographies, but it's not mandated. So it's always beneficial to try and get multi-site data or multi-country data if you can, but it's certainly not essential for the CE marking process. The only nuance or caveat to that is if there are known population demographic differences between countries. So this might be something, you know, if you're looking at skin types, then you need to consider the underlying ethnicity of populations and make sure that you're mapping to the demographic of that specific country. But in general, no, you don't need UK data for CE marking. It helps when you're having those procurement conversations to say we've already tried and tested it on UK data.
Okay, and then following on from the FDA question, there's been a question saying, is NHS approval sufficient for the European market? And I think maybe that...
No, it's not. So NHS itself doesn't approve anything. It can agree to purchase something, but that agreement to purchase a device does not mean that the European market should or can do so. You need that regulatory stamp of approval, which is the CE mark, to be able to go to the European market.
So in answer to this question, it's sort of more the other way around. It's more the CE mark, which is the stamp of approval for the European market, is one of the core requirements for NHS approval. Exactly.
And you may need to repeat some of these processes in each target country that you're going to. And I know that health tech startups want to scale very quickly globally via global deployments like app stores and things like that. But if you want to sell into healthcare systems in different countries, each country may ask for evidence in each of their jurisdictions, and that's up to them. So it can be a longer and tougher process than you may imagine.
One quite good open question. What do we need to measure?
What do we need to measure? So it entirely depends on what you want to claim, is always my answer. If you are making a claim, you need to be able to support that claim with scientific evidence. And what you measure will depend on obviously what you're claiming, but what you found in a literature review about what others have claimed in that and measured in that sector. And then you will need to continually measure that once you're on market as well. So let's use an example. Let's say you have a device, let's say it's an app that can diagnose diabetes if someone plugs in their blood glucose measurements and what they've eaten. Well, you need to be somehow figuring out a way to measure whether or not your app was correct in that diagnosis. So you'll need to get follow-up data in some way. And so the regulators, if you want to make that claim and have that intended use, the regulators will need to see that you've built in processes where you can get that follow-up data and check if your diagnosis was correct or not. Otherwise, you're going to put something on market that you will never know was accurate or not, which clearly is unacceptable in a healthcare situation. Any other questions?
Yeah. A fun question. This sounds very onerous and expensive. There are much easier markets for digital health startups. Does the UK government provide any material support in terms of pre-approval or even funding to ease this long journey?
So it is onerous and expensive, but you're in a regulated industry in healthcare. So if you're a health tech startup, you are not having the free ride that you do in, say, wellness or any other kind of sector. If you're going to the financial health tech startup, there's regulation in that sector too. So you picked the wrong sector if you want an easy ride and don't want to worry about expensive regulation. The second part of that question, does the UK government provide material support in terms of pre-approval? No. The UK government relies on the medical device regulations. If there's no such thing as a pre-approval, you can get ethics approval to conduct studies before you've got your CE marking. but you need to apply for the ethics through the route I talked about first. And I think they asked about funding. So yes, you can apply for grants. If you are doing an AI system of some kind, then there is £150 million fund from the government to to fund clinical studies and deployments at various stages of maturity. So you should look up what's known as the AAC AI grant. And applications, the first round has already been completed. The second round was due to start in July, but I believe has been delayed slightly due to COVID. So look up the AAC AI grant if you're in the AI space. If you are doing just digital therapeutics, then you should have a look at Innovate UK, which is a grant funding body in the UK for innovative projects. And they have a stream, I think it's called Smart Grants, where you can apply for money in the digital health space to help fund these processes.
Sorry, Hugh, could you talk for a moment about MHRA and NICE, just as these are very important things that come up in the UK and are often quite alien?
Sure. Okay, so the MHRA are the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority. I think I got that acronym right, the MHRA. And they are the government body who are assigned the task of overseeing the regulation of all medical devices and drugs in the UK. So they're the equivalent of the FDA, and every country will have the equivalent of an MHRA. So the MHRA, you won't necessarily have to interact with directly. You can go through your notified bodies or your regulatory experts, but they have the final overseeing decision and power over all medical devices in the UK market. NICE is another independent body, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. And they are a sort of academic scientific outfit who look at evidence and all the available evidence around specific care pathways, drugs, medical devices, and interventions. So NICE, and I haven't really talked about this so far, NICE is the kind of body that once you have regulatory approval and you have a health economics analysis, you may well want to approach NICE for what's known as a Healthtec assessment, where they will get, for a fee, I think it's about £50,000, they will gather an independent clinical group to look at all the evidence that you can provide, and they'll interview and ask questions, and they will produce a summary of all of your evidence, and they can make a recommendation that, or an approval of sorts, it's not a kite marking, that your interventional device can be used by the NHS. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. Once you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, it's an incredibly powerful tool to get a nice Healthtec assessment and that process underway.
Cool. What is the timeline for bringing an established medical device to the UK market?
Okay, timeline for an established medical device. So let's make a couple of assumptions. You have CE mark approval, you have published studies, and you have a health economics analysis. Your timeline can be relatively quick. Procurement cycles in the NHS, typically 6 months to a year. So that would be the timeline for an established medical device. It is longer if you're still at the prototype phase, much, much, much longer.
What sort of timeline?
I mean, if you're starting from scratch, you're at least 3 or 4 years away from market access.
Okay, no more questions for now. So yeah, last chances, guys.
Brilliant. Feel free to ask any questions. I saw someone say, will the slides be available? I think they will if you fill in some kind of feedback form. And I think there'll be a video link as well afterwards. Is that correct, Sam?
Yes, that is. That is. Does anyone else have any more questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right then. Well, thank you very much, Hugh and Sal, for taking the time to come today. We will be sending out an email with links to a video and the slides from today along with contact details for you to approach Hardian Health if you have any specific questions about what it is that you're doing, how to engage in, as you're all aware in healthcare. There's only so much that we can generalize, and a lot of information is really, very bespoke. These are the people to be speaking to about it. So on that note, thank you very much for taking the time, Hugh and Sal. Thank you everyone who came today. And next webinar will be running in 2 weeks' time, entitled "There Are Several Ways to Scare Schrodinger's Cat." This is about GDPR in healthcare in the UK and looking out for patient data and what you need to be looking out for when you're engaging with that. So thank you very much, Hugh and Sal.
Thank you, Sam, for having us. And to anyone in the audience, if you want to ask other questions of us, you can get in touch. We're at hardianhealth.com. Very happy to have a chat with anybody at any stage in their health technology journey.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.